The Murdaugh name had been synonymous with power in the South Carolina Lowcountry for nearly a century. 3 generations of prosecutors who had wielded authority over life and death in ways that few American families could imagine. For 87 consecutive years, a Murdaugh had served as the elected solicitor of the 14th Judicial Circuit, a dynasty so entrenched that the very concept of justice in this corner of the state seemed inseparable from the family that administered it. They were legal royalty, their influence extending through courtrooms and country clubs, through business dealings and political connections, through a web of relationships that made them seem untouchable to those who lived in their shadow. Their compound on the Salkehatchie River, a sprawling property called Moselle, represented the physical manifestation of their status, a hunting lodge and family retreat that spoke of generational wealth and the confidence that comes from knowing your position is secure. But behind the facade of Southern gentility and legal respectability, Alex Murdaugh, the heir apparent to this dynasty, was building a different kind of legacy, one constructed on theft, deception, and ultimately murder. When the bodies of his wife Maggie and son Paul were discovered on the grounds of Moselle on the evening of the 7th of June 2021, the first cracks appeared in an edifice that had seemed impenetrable. What followed would be the unraveling of a man, a family, and a mythology, exposing a web of crimes so extensive and so brazen that it would captivate a nation and force a reckoning with the corrupting nature of unchecked power. This is the story of how the Murdaugh dynasty came crashing down, and how the man who should have been its greatest heir became its ultimate destroyer. The history of the Murdaugh family in the South Carolina Lowcountry began in 1920, when Randolph Murdaugh Sr. was elected as the solicitor for the 14th Judicial Circuit, a prosecutorial position that covered 5 rural counties along the state's southern coast. The role carried enormous power in this corner of South Carolina, the authority to decide which cases would be prosecuted and which would be dismissed, which defendants would face the full weight of the law, and which would receive leniency. Randolph Murdaugh Sr. held this position until his death in 1940, at which point his son, Randolph Murdaugh Jr., seamlessly assumed the role, continuing a pattern of dynastic succession that would have seemed more appropriate in a monarchy than a democracy. Randolph Jr. served for decades before passing the mantle to his own son, Randolph Murdaugh III, who continued the family tradition until his retirement in 2006. By the time the dynasty ended, through the decision not to seek re-election rather than through electoral defeat, the Murdaughs had shaped the administration of justice in the Lowcountry for the better part of a century. Their name was on buildings, their influence was woven into every institution, and their position seemed as permanent as the moss-draped oaks that lined the region's country roads. But the family's influence extended far beyond the prosecutor's office. The Murdaughs had built a personal injury law firm, Peters, Murdaugh, Parker, Eltsroth, and Dietrich, known locally simply as PMPED, that had become one of the most successful plaintiffs' practices in the state. The firm represented victims of accidents and injuries, securing settlements and verdicts that generated enormous fees, wealth that funded the family's lifestyle, and reinforced their position at the apex of Lowcountry society. Alex Murdaugh, born Richard Alexander Murdaugh in 1968, had grown up as the crown prince of this empire, expected from birth to take his place in the family business, and perhaps, eventually in the solicitor's office that his grandfather, father, and great-grandfather had occupied. He attended the University of South Carolina for both undergraduate and law school, following the prescribed path with the ease of someone for whom doors had always opened automatically. He joined the family firm after graduation, building a reputation as a skilled personal injury attorney whose family connections and courtroom abilities combined to make him a formidable advocate for his clients. He married Maggie Brandstetter in 1993, and together they raised 2 sons, Buster and Paul, the next generation of a dynasty that seemed destined to continue indefinitely. The Alex Murdaugh that the world saw was a genial Southern lawyer, a man whose good old boy charm masked a sharp legal mind and an aggressive approach to litigation. He was tall and red-headed, his appearance distinctive in courtrooms where he had tried cases and in social settings where his family's name guaranteed a warm reception. He served as a part-time prosecutor, maintaining the family's connection to the solicitor's office even after Randolph III's retirement had ended their formal control of it. He was active in community affairs, his generosity and involvement burnishing the family image and reinforcing the mythology of the Murdaughs as public servants whose wealth was matched by their commitment to the region. But beneath this carefully cultivated exterior, a different Alex Murdaugh was operating, one whose relationship with the truth was casual at best, and whose financial dealings would eventually reveal a pattern of theft and deception that defied comprehension. For years, perhaps decades, Alex had been stealing from his clients, his law firm, and anyone else whose trust provided an opportunity for exploitation. The amounts were staggering, eventually calculated in the millions of dollars. Money that funded a lifestyle far beyond what even his legitimate income could support. Money that fed addictions and covered losses and created a cascade of financial obligations that demanded ever more theft to sustain. The first major crack in the Murdaugh facade came not from financial exposure but from tragedy. A boat crash in February 2019 that would set in motion the chain of events leading to murder. Paul Murdaugh, Alex's younger son, was 19 years old and drunk when he crashed the family boat into a bridge piling near Paris Island. The crash killed 19-year-old Mallory Beach, a young woman whose life was extinguished by Paul's recklessness, and whose death would haunt the Murdaugh family, with consequences they had not anticipated. Paul was charged with boating under the influence causing death, felony charges that carried serious prison time. But the Murdaugh influence seemed to activate immediately, with allegations that the family was attempting to manipulate the investigation and influence potential witnesses. The case dragged on, delayed by motions and maneuvering that critics attributed to the family's connections. Justice seemingly available to a Murdaugh on different terms than it would be for an ordinary defendant. Mallory Beach's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit, seeking accountability that the criminal justice system seemed reluctant to provide, and this litigation would eventually become a thread that connected to the financial crimes Alex had been concealing. The wrongful death lawsuit required disclosure of the Murdaugh family's financial assets, a discovery process that threatened to expose the precarious state of Alex's finances and the crimes he had committed to sustain his lifestyle. For years, Alex had been stealing settlement funds intended for clients, diverting money through a fake account he had created with the misleadingly similar name Forge, designed to be confused with the legitimate settlement company Forge Consulting. He had stolen from the family of his own housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield, who had died in a fall at the Murdaugh home in 2018, manipulating a settlement that should have benefited her sons and instead funneling the money to himself. He had taken fees he was not entitled to, falsified records, and created a financial house of cards that required constant attention to prevent collapse. The Mallory Beach litigation threatened to bring scrutiny that this structure could not survive, to expose the theft and fraud that had been hidden behind the Murdaugh name and the assumptions of legitimacy that accompanied it. As the litigation progressed through 2020 and into 2021, the pressure on Alex intensified, the walls closing in on a man whose crimes were becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. The evening of the 7th of June, 2021, began like countless other evenings at Moselle, the Murdaugh hunting property on the Salkehatchie River. The sprawling estate was a retreat from the pressures of legal practice and public life, a place where the family could relax among the fields and forests that had belonged to them for generations. Alex, Maggie, and Paul were all present that evening, the family gathering for what should have been a quiet night at the property. But sometime in the hours after darkness fell, violence erupted that would shatter the Murdaugh mythology forever. Maggie Murdaugh, Alex's wife of nearly 30 years, was shot multiple times with a rifle near the dog kennels on the property. Paul Murdaugh, the son whose legal troubles had become a source of family stress, was shot twice with a shotgun at close range, the wounds so devastating that they were immediately fatal. Their bodies were discovered on the grounds, the crime scene, suggesting a brutal double homicide that seemed to have come from nowhere. Alex Murdaugh called 911 at approximately 10:07 p.m., his voice frantic as he reported discovering the bodies of his wife and son. He claimed to have arrived at the property and found them dead, the victims of an unknown assailant who had apparently attacked them while Alex was away visiting his ailing father. His grief seemed overwhelming, his shock apparently genuine, his status as a victim unquestioned in the initial hours after the discovery. The South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, known as SLED, was called in to investigate the double homicide, their involvement reflecting the high-profile nature of the victims and the family's prominence in the region. The investigation began with Alex as a grieving husband and father, a man who had suffered an unimaginable loss at the hands of unknown killers. But as investigators began their work, inconsistencies emerged that would gradually transform Alex from victim to suspect, from mourner to murderer. The initial investigation focused on potential connections to Paul's pending criminal case, the theory being that someone seeking revenge for Mallory Beach's death might have targeted the Murdaugh family. This possibility was taken seriously, the threats that had allegedly been made against Paul providing a plausible motive for violence. Investigators also explored whether the murders might be connected to Alex's legal work, the possibility that a disgruntled opposing party or a client who felt wronged might have sought violent retribution. The Murdaugh family's prominence made them potential targets for various kinds of resentment, and investigators initially cast a wide net in their search for suspects. But as they examined the evidence more closely, as they reconstructed the timeline of that evening, troubling questions began to emerge about Alex's account of his whereabouts and activities. The forensic evidence from the crime scene was extensive, the investigation benefiting from modern techniques that could extract information from even the most chaotic scenes of violence. Blood spatter analysis revealed patterns consistent with the shooter standing in close proximity to the victims, suggesting that this was not a drive-by attack or an ambush from a distance, but an intimate killing by someone the victims may have known and trusted. Shell casings recovered from the scene would eventually be matched to weapons owned by the Murdaugh family, guns that had been in Alex's possession before they conveniently disappeared in the aftermath of the murders. And crucially, investigators recovered video evidence that would prove devastating to Alex's alibi, footage that placed him at the scene of the crime during the window when the murders must have occurred. The video that would ultimately help convict Alex Murdaugh came from his own son's phone. Paul had recorded a short clip at the dog kennels just minutes before his death, a mundane piece of footage that captured the dogs and the property and, crucially, voices in the background. Audio analysis of the video identified 3 voices: Paul's, Maggie's, and unmistakably, Alex's. The video was time-stamped at 8:44 p.m., placing Alex at the kennels at a time when he claimed to have been elsewhere. His alibi, his insistence that he had not been at the kennels that evening, was contradicted by his own voice, preserved on his dead son's phone. This evidence would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, proof that Alex had lied about his presence at the crime scene during the critical window when the murders occurred. But the murder investigation was only one thread in a tapestry of criminality that was rapidly unraveling. In the weeks and months following the killings, additional revelations emerged that exposed the full scope of Alex Murdaugh's deceptions. Financial investigators began examining his accounts, discovering the systematic theft that had been occurring for years. The forged scheme was exposed. The fake account that had diverted millions in client funds, revealed as a fraud that had victimized some of the most vulnerable people Alex had been hired to represent. The Satterfield case was re-examined. The suspicious death of the family housekeeper and the subsequent mishandling of settlement funds, raising questions about whether Alex had been involved in her death, as well as the theft of money meant for her sons. Each new revelation added to the portrait of a man whose entire life had been a performance, whose identity as a respected attorney and community pillar was a facade concealing predation and deception on a massive scale. The most bizarre chapter in the Murdaugh saga came on the 4th of September 2021, less than 3 months after the murders, when Alex orchestrated a scheme so strange that it initially seemed to support his claims of being a victim rather than a perpetrator. He arranged to meet Curtis Eddie Smith, a former client with a drug history, on a rural road. ostensibly to pay Smith money he owed, but according to Alex's later account, he had actually arranged for Smith to shoot him, a murder-for-hire scheme that would allow his surviving son Buster to collect a $10 million life insurance payout. Smith allegedly shot Alex in the head, but the wound was superficial, a graze that caused bleeding but no serious injury. Alex called 911 reporting that he had been shot by a passing motorist, presenting himself as the victim of a random attack that seemed to confirm that the Murdaugh family was being targeted by unknown assailants. The scheme collapsed almost immediately under the weight of its own absurdity. Smith, when apprehended, told a different story than Alex had presented to investigators. Evidence at the scene was inconsistent with the random attack Alex had described, and the timing of the incident, coming just days after Alex had been confronted by his law firm about missing funds and asked to resign, suggested a desperate attempt to escape accountability rather than a genuine attack. Alex eventually admitted that he had arranged the shooting, claiming that his opioid addiction had clouded his judgment and that he had been in a suicidal state that led him to make this terrible decision. He checked into a drug rehabilitation facility, his admission of addiction adding yet another layer to a narrative that was becoming almost impossible to follow. The murder-for-hire scheme, rather than establishing his victim status, instead reinforced the prosecution's theory that Alex Murdaugh was a man capable of elaborate deception and desperate measures when cornered. The investigation into the murders of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh continued through the remainder of 2021 and into 2022, gathering evidence and building a case that would eventually lead to Alex's arrest. Financial crimes charges came first, a litany of theft and fraud counts that documented the millions of dollars Alex had stolen from clients, partners, and anyone else whose trust he could exploit. The scope of the theft was staggering, investigators eventually identifying more than 100 victims whose funds had been diverted, lives damaged by a man who had presented himself as their advocate while treating their settlements as his personal piggy bank. Alex was disbarred, his law license stripped away, the professional identity that had defined his public persona destroyed by his own criminal conduct. The Murdaugh name, once synonymous with legal authority in the Low Country, became associated with scandal and shame, the dynasty's reputation crumbling with each new revelation. The arrest for the murders came on the 14th of July, 2022, more than a year after Maggie and Paul were killed at Moselle. Alex Murdaugh was charged with 2 counts of murder, the culmination of an investigation that had methodically assembled the evidence necessary to bring the most serious charges possible. The announcement sent shockwaves through South Carolina and beyond. The formal accusation that a scion of one of the state's most prominent legal families had murdered his own wife and son. Alex maintained his innocence, his attorneys promising a vigorous defense that would challenge every aspect of the prosecution's case. He was held without bail, his freedom revoked, his days of manipulating the legal system from a position of privilege apparently over. The trial that would follow would become one of the most watched legal proceedings in recent American history. A spectacle that combined elements of true crime fascination with questions about power, privilege, and the capacity of the justice system to hold the powerful accountable. The pretrial period was consumed by discovery and motions, both sides preparing for a confrontation that would determine whether Alex Murdaugh would spend the rest of his life in prison. The prosecution assembled its evidence. The kennel video that placed Alex at the scene, the forensic analysis of blood spatter and ballistics, the timeline that left no room for an outside assailant, the financial pressure that provided a motive for eliminating family members who might expose his crimes. They prepared to present a narrative of a man whose web of lies had become so tangled that he saw murder as the only escape, who had killed his wife and son in a desperate attempt to generate sympathy and divert attention from the financial crimes that were about to be exposed. The defense prepared its own narrative, emphasizing the lack of direct physical evidence linking Alex to the shootings, challenging the reliability of the state's timeline, and pointing to alternative suspects who might have had reason to target the Murdaugh family. The stage was set for a trial that would captivate millions and conclude with a moment as dramatic as any in recent legal history. The community of Hampton, South Carolina, The small town that had been the seat of Murdaugh power for nearly a century prepared to host a trial that would bring unprecedented attention to their quiet corner of the state. Media from around the world descended on the Colleton County Courthouse, where the proceedings would be held due to a change of venue from Hampton County. The courtroom would be the setting for a reckoning, a confrontation between a man who had seemed untouchable and a system that was finally demanding accountability. The victims, Maggie and Paul, would be represented by photographs and testimony and the hollow spaces they had left in the lives of those who loved them. And Alex Murdaugh, the man accused of killing them, would sit at the defense table, his fate in the hands of a jury that would be asked to believe either that he was a grieving victim of terrible circumstances or a cold-blooded murderer who had destroyed his own family to protect his secrets. The trial of Alex Murdaugh began on the 23rd of January 2023 in the Colleton County Courthouse, a setting that would become familiar to millions of viewers who followed the proceedings through the unprecedented live television coverage that had been granted. The decision to allow cameras in the courtroom transformed what might have been a regional legal proceeding into a national spectacle, every moment broadcast to an audience hungry for the next chapter in a saga that had captivated true crime enthusiasts since the first reports of the double homicide. The courthouse itself was modest by the standards of buildings that had hosted famous trials. A brick structure in the small town of Walterboro that suddenly found itself at the center of international media attention. Satellite trucks lined the streets. Reporters did stand-ups on every available patch of sidewalk. And the courtroom gallery was packed with observers who had competed for the limited seats available to the public. The contrast between the sleepy southern town and the media circus that had descended upon it was jarring. A collision of worlds that spoke to the extraordinary nature of the case being tried within those walls. Judge Clifton Newman presided over the proceedings with the measured authority of a jurist who understood the weight of his responsibilities. An African-American judge presiding over the trial of a white defendant from one of the most powerful families in the region, Newman represented a kind of poetic justice that many observers noted, though he conducted himself with a scrupulous fairness that gave no hint of any agenda beyond the pursuit of truth. His courtroom was run with efficiency and decorum, the circus outside the doors giving way to serious legal proceedings within. He made rulings that shaped the contours of the trial, decisions about what evidence could be admitted and what arguments could be made that would prove crucial to the outcome. His management of the proceedings earned widespread praise. His patience with lengthy arguments and his firm control of the courtroom, establishing an atmosphere of gravity appropriate to a trial concerning the murders of a mother and son. The prosecution team was led by Creighton Waters, a career prosecutor whose methodical approach and folksy Southern manner masked a razor-sharp legal mind. Waters had spent his career in the South Carolina Attorney General's office, trying cases far from the spotlight that now illuminated his every word. He understood that the case against Alex Murdaugh was largely circumstantial, built on a foundation of lies and financial crimes, rather than eyewitness testimony or DNA evidence, placing the defendant's hands on the murder weapons. His strategy was to construct a narrative so compelling, supported by evidence so comprehensive, that the absence of direct proof would not matter. He would show the jury who Alex Murdaugh really was, the man behind the mask of the genial Southern lawyer, the thief and deceiver whose life was built on exploitation and lies. And he would demonstrate that on the night of the 7th of June 2021, this man had committed the ultimate act of desperation, murdering his wife and son to create a distraction from the financial crimes that were about to be exposed. The defense was led by Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin, two of the most prominent criminal defense attorneys in South Carolina. Harpootlian in particular brought a combative style and political connections that made him a formidable adversary. A former prosecutor himself who understood how the state built cases and how those cases could be dismantled. The defense strategy was to challenge every assumption, to emphasize the lack of direct evidence linking Alex to the shootings, and to point to alternative suspects whose existence created reasonable doubt about the defendant's guilt. They would acknowledge that Alex was a thief and a liar, recognizing that denying his financial crimes would destroy their credibility with the jury. But they would argue that being a bad person did not make him a murderer. Their task was to separate the admitted sins from the unproven accusations, to convince the jury that whatever else Alex Murdaugh might be, he was not the killer of his own family. The prosecution's opening statement laid out the case with the precision of a well-constructed legal brief, each element carefully positioned to support the overall narrative of guilt. Creighton Waters stood before the jury and promised to take them inside the life of Alex Murdaugh, to show them the reality behind the facade that had fooled so many for so long. He described the financial pressure that had been building in the weeks before the murders, the exposure that was imminent as the boat crash litigation forced disclosure of assets that would reveal the extent of Alex's theft. He previewed the evidence that would place Alex at the scene of the crime, despite his denials. The kennel video that captured his voice minutes before the murders occurred. He explained the theory of the case, that Alex had killed Maggie and Paul to create a wave of sympathy that would deflect attention from his crumbling empire. A desperate gambit by a desperate man whose lies had finally caught up with him. His presentation was calm and confident, the manner of a prosecutor who believed completely in the case he was presenting. The defense opening offered a different narrative, one that acknowledged Alex's moral failings while challenging the state's theory of murder. Jim Griffin stood before the jury and asked them to consider whether a man who loved his wife and son, whatever his other flaws, could really have committed such a terrible act. He pointed to the lack of physical evidence directly linking Alex to the shootings, the absence of blood spatter on his clothing, the missing murder weapons that had never been recovered. He suggested alternative suspects, including individuals who might have sought revenge for Mallory Beach's death or for other grievances against the Murdaugh family. He asked the jury to separate their feelings about Alex's financial crimes from the question of whether he had committed murder, to recognize that the state was asking them to convict based on lies and circumstances rather than proof. His tone was earnest, his arguments carefully constructed, his task monumental, given the weight of evidence that would follow. The prosecution began its presentation of evidence with the crime scene, the gruesome reality of what had happened at Moselle on the evening of the 7th of June 2021. Photographs were displayed showing the bodies of Maggie and Paul where they had fallen, the blood and violence preserved in clinical detail for the jury's examination. Expert witnesses described the wounds that had killed each victim, the shotgun blasts that had devastated Paul's head and body, the rifle shots that had ended Maggie's life. The brutality of the killings was emphasized, the close range at which the shots had been fired, the multiple wounds that suggested not a quick execution, but a sustained attack. The emotional impact on the courtroom was visible, jurors shifting uncomfortably as they confronted images of violence that most people never see outside of crime dramas. The prosecution's message was clear. These were not random killings by a stranger, but intimate murders committed by someone who had gotten close enough to inflict maximum damage. The forensic evidence was presented through a parade of expert witnesses whose testimony built the scientific foundation for the prosecution's case. Blood spatter analysts described patterns consistent with the shooter standing in close proximity to the victims, their conclusions supported by diagrams and photographs that illustrated the physics of violence. Ballistics experts testified about the weapons used, identifying the shotgun and rifle based on shell casings and projectile fragments recovered from the scene. They noted that the weapons had belonged to the Murdaugh family, guns that had been present at Moselle before the murders and had conveniently disappeared afterward. The defense challenged this testimony through cross-examination, questioning methodologies and highlighting uncertainties, but the overall picture that emerged was of crimes committed with family weapons by someone with intimate knowledge of the property and its layout. The timeline of the evening of June 7th became a critical battlefield, the prosecution working to establish that the window for the murders was so narrow that only Alex could have committed them. Witnesses testified about Alex's movements throughout the day, his activities in the hours leading up to the killings, his claimed whereabouts during the critical period when Maggie and Paul were shot. Cell phone records and GPS data were presented, digital breadcrumbs that tracked Alex's location with precision that he apparently had not anticipated. The prosecution demonstrated that Alex's story of being away from the kennels during the time of the murders was contradicted by the evidence, that his alibi collapsed under scrutiny, in ways that suggested consciousness of guilt rather than innocent confusion about details. The kennel video became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, the piece of evidence that most directly contradicted Alex's claims of innocence. The short clip, recorded by Paul on his phone at 8:44 p.m., was played for the jury multiple times. Its audio enhanced and analyzed by experts, who testified with certainty about what it captured. 3 voices were identified: Paul's, Maggie's, and unmistakably, Alex's. The prosecution called witnesses who knew Alex's voice well, individuals who had worked with him for years, and who identified the voice on the recording without hesitation. The defense challenged the identification, calling their own experts who questioned the reliability of voice recognition. But the accumulation of witnesses who confirmed it was Alex created a powerful impression. If the jury believed the voice was his, then they knew he had lied about being at the kennels that evening. And if he had lied about that, what else might he have lied about? The financial evidence was presented to establish motive, the prosecution arguing that Alex's crumbling empire of theft had created pressure that made murder seem like a rational escape. Forensic accountants testified about the scope of Alex's crimes: the millions of dollars stolen from clients, the fake forge account that had diverted settlement funds, the systematic exploitation of trust that had characterized his entire legal career. They documented the timing of specific thefts, showing that Alex's financial situation was deteriorating rapidly in the weeks before the murders. That exposure was imminent, as the boat crash litigation forced disclosure that would reveal his crimes. The prosecution's theory was that killing Maggie and Paul would generate sympathy that would delay scrutiny, that the tragedy of losing his wife and son would make people reluctant to investigate the grieving survivor. It was a motive born of desperation, the act of a man who saw murder as preferable to exposure. The parade of financial victims added emotional weight to the evidence of Alex's character. Former clients testified about trusting Alex with their settlements, about expecting money that never came, about the devastation they experienced when they learned that their advocate had been their exploiter. The Satterfield family's representative described the scheme that had stolen nearly $4 million intended for Gloria's sons, money that should have provided for young men who had lost their mother, but instead had enriched the man who may have been responsible for her death. These witnesses were not directly relevant to the murder charges, but they painted a portrait of a man capable of extraordinary callousness, someone whose regard for others' welfare was non-existent when it conflicted with his own interests. If he could steal from grieving families without remorse, the prosecution implied, why would anyone believe he was incapable of murder? The defense presented its case with the energy of attorneys fighting against overwhelming odds. They called witnesses who testified to Alex's love for his family, friends, and relatives, who described a devoted father and husband whose relationship with Maggie and Paul seemed genuine. They presented expert witnesses who challenged the prosecution's forensics, questioning the certainty of voice identification and the reliability of blood spatter analysis. They emphasized the lack of physical evidence directly connecting Alex to the shootings, the absence of gunshot residue on his clothing, the missing murder weapons that had never been found. They pointed to alternative suspects, individuals who might have had reason to target the Murdaugh family, suggesting that the investigation had focused so intently on Alex that other possibilities had been ignored. Their presentation was competent and thorough, but the weight of the prosecution's evidence hung over everything, a shadow that could not be dispelled by expert witnesses and character testimonials. The decision that would define the trial came when the defense announced that Alex Murdaugh would take the witness stand in his own defense. It was a calculated gamble, a recognition that the only way to overcome the evidence against him was to look the jury in the eye and proclaim his innocence directly. Defense attorneys typically advise against such testimony, the risks of cross-examination generally outweighing the benefits of the defendant's direct appeal. But Alex Murdaugh was a trial lawyer, a man who had spent his career persuading juries, and his attorneys apparently believed that his skills of persuasion might prove more powerful than the evidence arrayed against him. The announcement sent a ripple of anticipation through the courtroom and the millions watching at home, everyone understanding that the next hours would be crucial to the outcome of the trial. Alex Murdaugh's direct examination was a performance carefully crafted to generate sympathy and establish reasonable doubt. He spoke of his love for Maggie and Paul, his voice breaking as he described the discovery of their bodies on that terrible evening. He acknowledged his financial crimes, admitting to the theft and deception that the prosecution had documented. His candor apparently intended to establish credibility on the matters he was denying. He explained the lies he had told investigators, attributing them to the fog of opioid addiction and the confusion of grief rather than consciousness of guilt. And he addressed the kennel video directly, admitting for the first time that he had been at the kennels that evening, reversing months of denials and claiming that he had lied because he was paranoid about being falsely accused due to his discovery of the bodies. His explanation was convoluted, but delivered with apparent emotion, tears flowing as he described the trauma of losing his wife and son and the terror of being suspected of their murders. The cross-examination by Creighton Waters would become one of the most dramatic moments of the trial, a methodical destruction of Alex's credibility that left little room for the jury to believe his protestations of innocence. Waters approached the witness stand with the quiet confidence of a prosecutor who knew he had the ammunition to demolish his target. He began by walking Alex through his history of lies, each deception documented and presented for the jury's consideration. He showed how Alex had lied to his law partners, to his clients, to investigators, to judges, to virtually everyone whose trust he had been given. He established a pattern so comprehensive that the word of Alex Murdaugh was revealed as essentially worthless, a currency so debased by constant deception that no reasonable person could accept it at face value. Waters then turned to the specific lies about the evening of the murders, the alibis that had collapsed under investigation, and the explanations that had shifted as evidence emerged. He confronted Alex with the kennel video, playing the audio, and asking him to explain how his voice came to be captured at a location where he had repeatedly claimed not to have been. Alex's explanations grew increasingly strained, his composure cracking under questioning that left no avenue of escape. Waters highlighted the timing of Alex's reversal, noting that he had maintained his false alibi until the prosecution made clear that they had evidence disproving it. The implication was devastating. Alex had lied until lying was no longer tenable, changing his story only when caught, a pattern that suggested consciousness of guilt rather than innocent confusion. The questioning continued for hours, Waters systematically dismantling every element of Alex's defense, while the defendant grew visibly frustrated and flustered. Alex attempted to deploy the charm and verbal skills that had served him in courtrooms throughout his career. But against a prosecutor armed with documentary evidence of his deceptions, those skills proved inadequate. He grew defensive, his answers becoming longer and more rambling as he struggled to explain contradictions that could not be explained. He showed flashes of anger that undermined the image of grieving innocence his direct examination had attempted to cultivate. And perhaps most damagingly, he repeatedly invoked his addiction and his grief as explanations for behavior that seemed to require more sinister interpretation, excuses that grew less convincing with each repetition. The climax of the cross-examination came when Waters confronted Alex with the fundamental implausibility of his story. He asked Alex to explain how an unknown assailant could have arrived at Moselle, killed Maggie and Paul within minutes of the kennel video, and disappeared without leaving any trace of their presence. He pointed out that Alex's timeline left no room for this scenario, that if he was at the kennels at 8:44 and his wife and son were alive, the window for an outside killer to arrive, commit the murders, and escape was impossibly narrow. He noted that no evidence of any other person's presence had been found despite exhaustive investigation, that the only person known to have been at the scene with the victims was Alex himself. The logic was inescapable, presented with a clarity that made Alex's claims of innocence seem not just unbelievable, but absurd. Alex's responses to this questioning revealed a man whose story had finally run out of room to maneuver. He could not explain how an unknown killer had committed the crimes in the window available. He could not explain why he had lied about his whereabouts if he had nothing to hide. He could not explain how family weapons had been used without his knowledge, or why those weapons had disappeared after the murders. He could offer only protestations of innocence that rang hollow after hours of testimony that had established him as a liar without peer. His performance on the stand, intended to save him from conviction, had instead sealed his fate. His own words, providing the final pieces of a puzzle that the jury would now be asked to complete. The closing arguments offered each side a final opportunity to frame the evidence before the jury retired to deliberate. Creighton Waters delivered a summation that tied together the strands of evidence into a coherent narrative of guilt, his folksy manner giving way to a passionate plea for justice. He reminded the jury of the kennel video, the voice that placed Alex at the scene despite his denials. He reviewed the financial evidence, the motive that made murder rational in the twisted calculus of a desperate man. He walked through the lies, the pattern of deception that had characterized Alex's entire engagement with the investigation, and he asked the jury to use their common sense to recognize that the evidence pointed in only one direction, that the man who had lied about everything else was lying about this too. His closing was emotional but grounded, a final argument that left little room for doubt about what the evidence showed. The defense closing was a last attempt to create the reasonable doubt that would save Alex from conviction. Jim Griffin attacked the investigation, arguing that SLED had focused on Alex from the beginning and had ignored leads that pointed to other suspects. He emphasized the lack of physical evidence, the missing murder weapons, the absence of blood on Alex's clothing despite the close-range nature of the killings. He asked the jury to separate their feelings about Alex's financial crimes from the question of whether he had committed murder, to recognize that the state was asking them to convict based on circumstantial evidence and a damaged reputation rather than proof. His argument was competent and at times compelling, but it struggled against the weight of evidence that the prosecution had presented. A defense built more on raising questions than providing answers. The jury retired to deliberate on the 2nd of March 2023, carrying with them the weight of evidence and testimony that had consumed 6 weeks of trial. The deliberations would prove to be remarkably brief, a duration that spoke to the clarity with which the jurors viewed the case. They deliberated for approximately 3 hours before informing the court that they had reached a verdict, a speed that suggested the evidence had been overwhelming rather than closely contested. The announcement brought everyone rushing back to the courtroom. The moment of judgment finally at hand, after years of investigation and weeks of trial. The gallery filled quickly, observers understanding that they were about to witness the conclusion of one of the most watched trials in recent American history. The verdict was delivered with the formality that such moments require. The foreman standing to announce the jury's findings, while the courtroom held its collective breath. Guilty of murder in the death of Maggie Murdaugh. Guilty of murder in the death of Paul Murdaugh. The words fell like hammer blows, each repetition driving deeper into the carefully maintained composure that Alex had attempted to project. He showed little visible reaction as the verdicts were read, his face frozen in an expression that might have been shock or might have been the mask he had worn throughout his life, finally failing to conceal what lay beneath. The jury had rejected his protestations of innocence, had believed the evidence that placed him at the scene with motive and opportunity, had concluded that the man who had lied about everything else had lied about murder too. The dynasty that had seemed untouchable for nearly a century had finally been brought down, not by outside forces, but by the actions of its most prominent heir. Judge Newman's sentencing came immediately after the verdict, the mandatory nature of the punishment making extended deliberation unnecessary. Under South Carolina law, the conviction for murder carried a sentence of life in prison, without the possibility of parole, a penalty that left no room for judicial discretion. Before imposing this sentence, Newman offered Alex the opportunity to address the court, a moment that might have provided some insight into the mind of a man who had destroyed his own family. Alex's statement was brief and maintained his innocence, his voice steady as he declared that he had not killed Maggie and Paul, and expressed confidence that the truth would eventually emerge. It was a final act of denial, a refusal to accept responsibility that was consistent with the pattern he had established throughout his life. The victim impact statements that preceded the formal sentencing were delivered by representatives of both the Murdaugh family and others whose lives Alex had devastated. Maggie's sister spoke of the loss of a beloved sibling, the hole that her death had left in the family, the injustice of her life being taken by the man who had sworn to love and protect her. Other family members described the ongoing trauma of losing both Maggie and Paul, the difficulty of processing grief when the perpetrator was someone who had been trusted absolutely. The statements from Alex's financial victims added additional dimensions to the portrait of destruction. People whose trust had been exploited by a man who presented himself as their advocate. The cumulative effect was overwhelming. A catalog of harm that extended far beyond the two people Alex had killed to encompass dozens of lives damaged by his theft and deception. Judge Newman's sentencing statement was a reflection on the case, the defendant, and the meaning of the verdict that had been rendered. He spoke of the betrayal that the evidence had revealed. A man entrusted with authority who had used it to victimize the vulnerable. He addressed the murders specifically, describing the unique horror of a father killing his own son and a husband killing his own wife. He noted the complete absence of remorse that Alex had displayed. His continued insistence on innocence, despite the jury's finding of guilt. And he imposed the sentence that the law required: life in prison, without the possibility of parole for each murder conviction, the terms to run consecutively, ensuring that Alex Murdaugh would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. The dynasty that had ruled the Low Country for nearly a century ended not with a transition to the next generation, but with its last prominent member being led away in handcuffs. The aftermath of the verdict continued to unfold in the weeks and months that followed. Additional legal proceedings addressing the many other crimes Alex had committed. He pleaded guilty to the financial charges, admitting to the theft of approximately $9 million from clients and partners over a period of years. He received additional prison sentences for these crimes, terms that would run consecutively with his murder convictions. Though the practical effect was merely symbolic, given the life sentences he was already serving. The guilty pleas were perhaps a tacit acknowledgement that continued fighting was pointless, that the resources and energy required for additional trials would accomplish nothing when he was already guaranteed to die in prison. Or perhaps they were simply another calculation, a recognition that admitting to theft while continuing to deny murder might somehow preserve some fragment of the narrative he had tried to construct. The investigation into other potential crimes connected to Alex Murdaugh continued. Questions remaining about deaths and incidents that had previously been accepted as accidents or natural causes. The death of Gloria Satterfield in 2018. The housekeeper, whose fall at the Murdaugh home had been followed by the theft of settlement funds, received renewed scrutiny. Her body was exhumed. Her death investigated with the awareness that Alex's capacity for harm extended far beyond what had previously been understood. The boat crash that killed Mallory Beach was re-examined, questions raised about whether the investigation had been compromised by Murdaugh influence. Each thread led to additional questions. The full scope of Alex's crimes, perhaps still not completely understood, even after conviction and sentencing for the murders of his wife and son. The community of the Low Country faced its own reckoning in the aftermath of the trial. Forced to confront the reality that the family they had trusted for generations had produced a monster. The assumption that the Murdaughs were public servants whose power was wielded benevolently had been shattered, replaced by questions about what else might have been hidden behind the facade of respectability. The institutions that had enabled the family's dominance were examined with new skepticism. The cozy relationships between law enforcement and prosecutors that had characterized the region suddenly seeming less like efficiency and more like corruption. Reform efforts were initiated, attempts to prevent the concentration of power that had allowed one family to operate above the law for so long. Whether these efforts would succeed in fundamentally changing the culture of the Low Country remained to be seen, but the trial had at least forced a conversation that had been suppressed for decades. The Murdaugh saga became a cultural phenomenon that extended far beyond the courtroom, spawning documentaries, podcasts, books, and endless media analysis. The combination of elements was irresistible. A powerful family brought low by their own crimes. A murder mystery with a surprise reveal. Financial scheming on a massive scale, and a trial that had been broadcast live to millions of viewers. The case became a reference point in discussions of privilege and accountability, a demonstration that even the most entrenched power could be challenged when the evidence was overwhelming and the crimes were too severe to ignore. True crime enthusiasts dissected every aspect of the case, analyzing evidence and debating theories with an intensity that reflected the story's grip on the public imagination. Alex Murdaugh was transferred to a South Carolina state prison to begin serving his sentences. His days reduced to the routines of incarceration that would define the remainder of his existence. The man who had grown up expecting to inherit a dynasty found himself instead at the bottom of an institutional hierarchy. His power stripped away, his name now associated with shame rather than authority. He continued to maintain his innocence regarding the murders, filing appeals that challenged the conviction on various grounds. His attorneys argued that the extensive media coverage had prejudiced the jury, that certain evidence should have been excluded, that their client had not received the fair trial to which he was entitled. These appeals worked their way through the legal system, offering slim hope of overturning verdicts that had been based on overwhelming evidence. The prison where Alex would spend his remaining years was a far cry from the luxury he had enjoyed at Moselle and the privilege that had characterized his entire life. The hunting lodge on the Salkehatchie River, the symbol of Murdaugh power for generations, was sold to pay the victims of his financial crimes. The proceeds distributed among those he had exploited. The law firm that had borne the family name removed it, distancing themselves from the scandal that had consumed their former partner. The courthouse where Murdaughs had prosecuted cases for 87 years continued to function, but now, with different names and different assumptions about who could be trusted with power. The dynasty was finished, its legacy transformed from one of service to one of corruption. Its final chapter, written not by a successor, but by prosecutors who had brought its most prominent member to justice. The victims of Alex Murdaugh's crimes continued to seek the closure that his conviction could not fully provide. Maggie and Paul were gone forever, their lives stolen by the man who should have protected them, their futures erased by bullets fired in desperation. The families who had trusted Alex with their legal matters worked to rebuild from the financial devastation his theft had caused, some recovering funds through lawsuits and settlements, while others faced losses that could never be fully remedied. Mallory Beach's family continued to pursue accountability for her death, the boat crash case grinding forward, even as the criminal matter against Paul had been mooted by his murder. The ripples of harm extended in every direction, touching lives across the Low Country and beyond, a testament to the destruction that one man's crimes could cause when enabled by power and protected by privilege. In his prison cell, Alex Murdaugh confronted a reality stripped of the pretenses that had sustained him throughout his life. The charm that had persuaded juries and manipulated clients was useless within institutional walls. The family name that had opened doors for generations now marked him as a target, a fallen figure whose downfall provided satisfaction to those who had resented Murdaugh power. The financial resources that had funded his lifestyle were gone, consumed by legal fees and victim restitution, and the collapse of the empire he had helped to build and then to destroy. He would age in that cell, watching the years pass without freedom, without family, without anything but the knowledge of what he had done and what it had cost him. Whether he would ever accept responsibility for the murders, he would ever acknowledge the truth that the jury had found, remained unknown. But the justice system had rendered its verdict, and that verdict would stand regardless of what he admitted or denied. The story of Alex Murdaugh was, in the end, a story about the corrupting nature of power and the consequences of believing oneself to be above the law. For nearly a century, his family had wielded authority with an assumption of impunity that had proven partially justified, their influence protecting them from accountability that others would have faced. Alex had inherited not just the position but the attitude, the belief that rules applied to others but not to him, that his status granted permission to take what he wanted and do what he wished. This belief had enabled theft on a massive scale, deceptions that victimized the vulnerable, and ultimately, the murder of his own wife and son when his crimes threatened to be exposed. The trial and conviction represented a refutation of this belief, a statement by the justice system that power had limits and that even a Murdaugh could be brought to account. Whether this lesson would be learned by others who held positions of trust remained to be seen. But the example had been set, written in verdict and sentence that would echo through legal history. And in the memories of those who loved them, Maggie and Paul Murdaugh lived on. They were remembered not as victims, but as the people they had been. A mother whose warmth had touched everyone who knew her. A son whose troubles had not defined his character. Their photographs showed smiling faces. Their stories captured moments of joy and connection that had been real even if the man who shared their lives had proven to be a monster. The tragedy of their deaths was compounded by the identity of their killer, the betrayal adding layers of horror that no stranger's violence could have matched. But they were more than the manner of their dying, more than evidence in a murder trial, more than characters in a true crime narrative. They were human beings who had deserved to live, whose futures had been stolen, whose absence left holes in the lives of everyone who loved them. In remembering them, rather than simply the case that bore their killer's name, there was perhaps some measure of the honor they deserved.